So I had some interest in how to use the PowerShell directly. So instead of logging into a Linux machine to work with your MariaDB database, instead just use the PowerShell on your local machine and SSH to it. So I'm going to show you how to do that. But in order to connect to a MariaDB database, you have to use an ODBC driver. There's actually two ways to do it. You can use an ODBC driver, or since it's PowerShell and it supports .NET, you could use the .NET connector for MySQL as well. There's also an ODBC driver for MariaDB itself. I think 309 is the latest one, but I've noticed it's a little bit buggy, so I've been using the MySQL driver. So I went to Google, and the one I'm looking for is the one available from MySQL, right, for the ODBC driver. So I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to download that driver. So I'm on Microsoft Windows. Doesn't matter what OS. So I want the 64-bit version of the driver, which is right here. So I'm going to click to download that. You have to log in with, so you have to have an account with Oracle in order to download. It's a free account. You don't have to pay for it. You can just sign up and get a free account. So let me log in real quick. So once you log in, you'll have the button to download. So I'm going to go ahead and download. If you just have to be careful you download the right architecture, right? 64 or 32-bit, one or the other. So I download the 64-bit. I've got a 64-bit machine, but you'll see when we open PowerShell, you have to choose whether you use 64-bit version of PowerShell or 32-bit. So if you're going to use the ODBC driver, it has to be the matching architecture. So it doesn't really matter too much for a lot of things that we're doing, in this exercise. But either way, just make sure you understand which architecture you downloaded. All right, so I'm going to go through the installer here. To install the driver, you just click the buttons. I'm just going to do a typical install. All right, I'm going to click the install button. All right, that's it. It's finished, right? So I have it installed. So now I can set up my ODBC driver. So to do that, I'm just going to search for ODBC driver. I'm going to go to my 64-bit drivers. I already did a 32-bit driver earlier, so I'm going to create another one. So we're going to use this MySQL ODBC driver. I think that's the right one. I got two of them in here. I'm not sure which is the 32 and which is the 64. All right, so my database name is INFO-365 64. So I remember it's the 64-bit. Then I have to put in the IP address of the server. And I'll show you how I'm doing this in a minute, but it's just going to be 127.0.0.1. Root with no username. I'm just going to click test to see if that connects. And it connected. And I'm going to show you how I did that, how I get this to connect using my local loopback. It's going to be very similar to what we did with the MySQL Workbench. So I'm going to click OK. So now I've got my INFO-365 64 driver. Now the problem here is, right, so I've got this set up, which makes sense, right? You want to make a note of the driver name here, which I'm going to show you why here in a second. But let me go ahead and minimize this. So this probably looks familiar, right? This is MySQL Workbench. And if you followed along previously, if I right-click this and just go to Edit Connection, this looks pretty familiar. The way that we're connecting to MariaDB is first, MySQL Workbench is logging in using the SSH hostname and username, right? So first it's trying to connect to it's trying to SSH directly to the server, right? And then once it's connected to the server, then since it's on the server at that point, it can use the local loopback. So you don't necessarily have to set up the firewall, right? So those of you that ended up setting up SQL Yog, you were able to, you probably poked a hole in the firewall to make this work, but it's not a very secure way to connect to your server, right? Just opening up port 3306. So you can kind of work around that. I'm going to show you how to do that. So here's the thing. If I wanted to, so I have another one over here. Here I'm trying to connect directly to 127.0.0.1, right? So it's not trying to SSH first. It's just going to try to connect directly to that host name. And if I try to test the connection, of course, it's going to fail because it's not running on my local system. And there's nothing's listening on port 3306 to redirect that traffic up to the server. So we can use SSH to do that. So if we open up our PowerShell and you run this command, so what this is doing is instead of just SSHing to the server, this is normally all we put is this section on the end here. The -L creates a tunnel So it's going to listen locally on 127.0.0.1 port 3306, and then it's going to redirect that traffic on the other side of the tunnel to port 3306 locally. So this, so it's going to listen on 3306, and it's going to redirect that traffic on the, to the server that we're sending to on 3306, which is exactly what we want. So if I click enter here and I log into my server, all right, so I'm connected now, right? I'm just normal SSH connection. But now if I click my test connection in here, it works, right? So I'm able to connect to that server. So I can open this up and I can interact with the server just as if it were local, right? Using that SSH tunnel. So kind of a neat little trick to get a connection. Now, of course, the reason we have to do this is if you're going to use PowerShell to work with your MariaDB, PowerShell has to have that tunnel open in order to connect to that remote server. So if I go back to my ODBC driver, right? So in the ODBC driver, I'm using 127.0.0.1. I test it. It works, right? We're able to connect to it. So that's my ODBC connection. So now let's see if we can use PowerShell to connect using that ODBC driver. So my first step is I have to open up PowerShell. So on most systems, you're going to have, we've been in this class, you've been following along, I've been using just regular PowerShell, but you'll also see PowerShell ISE. So PowerShell ISE is an integrated development environment, or really they call it ISE for integrated scripting environment, right? So this is kind of like Visual Studio or something like that, but or NetBeans if you use that in other classes for Java and so forth. But it's for PowerShell, right? So it's an IDE for PowerShell, basically. So I'm going to open mine as administrator. You don't necessarily have to. In general, I'll typically open this as administrator. All right, so Windows PowerShell ISE is opening. And let me drag it over here. So with the PowerShell, so instead of just having the PowerShell prompt at the bottom, now you've got this scripting portion up here at the top. So for example, if I do write.host test, I should be able to execute that. So if I go up here, hit the little run script button, and down here it executes that command, right? So pretty straightforward. So if I wanted to connect to a MariaDB server using ODBC, so there's an ODBC library for PowerShell. So I have to create a new object. So I just call it .con for connection, right? Short for connection. So the class that we're going to use is system.data.odbc. You can see here it'll start to suggest things as you go, right? So ODBC dot, and then we're going to do an ODBC connection. And so that's going to create an object called using the ODBC connection class. Then I can start doing stuff with this, right? So the first thing I need to do is provide a connection string, right? So we need a connection string to connect. This is a property, not a method. So the DSN name, so that's the name that we created, right? So I called it INFO-365. Oops, let me try this again. Sorry. So I called it INFO-365-64 for 64-bit. And then I need the UID, which is the user ID, is going to be root. And let's see, I need a password is going to be empty, right? Oops. So the parameter is password. We're just going to leave that blank. And that's it, right? That's all I really need. Normally, you probably want to identify the database that you wanted to connect to. So the thing is, I didn't indicate a database here. So one easy way to do that is in the ODBC connection. I'm going to go down here to databases, and I'm going to select college scorecard. And if I test that, right, I should be able to connect. So I don't have to put it in this connection string. It's just a little bit easier. All right, so now I've got my connection string. The next step is to open the connection. So that is a method, right, to open the connection. And if I did this right, and I hit play, we get an error, and it tells us that access is denied for user at localhost to database college scorecard. So I think maybe this has to be a lowercase r for root. Yeah, sorry, I forgot it's case sensitive, right? So that worked, right? So I was able to run that, and it connects to my database, which is good. So the next step is we want to try to do a query, right? So I'm just going to create a variable called query. I'm going to make it, select, I don't know, star from, actually, yeah, from school, right? Because I know that's a table in there. I'm only going to do inst name and maybe one other field, city, right? For example, inst name and city from school. And since I don't want to have a billion things here, we're going to limit it to just the top 10 rows, right? So we'll just get the top 10 rows. Nice simple query, right? And see if we can make this work. So the next step is I have to execute that query, right? So I'm going to do statement. I like to use the term statement. So this is going to be a new object. And we're going to, again, we have to use the system.data. ODBC, and we're going to pass a command, right? So ODBC, this is an ODBC command, and it's going to be our query, and the connection is going to be connection, right? So that should connect and execute that, and then we're going to get back our result, right? So my result has to be an object, right? So it's going to be a basically like an array, right? We did this sort of in PHP, same idea. It's a little bit more sophisticated though in .NET. We're going to use a data set. So a data set is essentially like a table, right? So we're essentially getting a table back from the database. So that's it, right? So that should execute the command. Now we just have to get the results from executing that statement into $result, right? So that's the last step, and just a little shorthand to do that. New object. I'm putting a parenthesis on here because we just want this to, this is just a method that's going to run. ODBC adapter. Whoops. And that is a method, ODBC adapter, so we're going to pass the statement into that. So all this is one variable, right? So when we execute that, it's essentially a variable that we get back. And then we can use a different, so since that's, essentially a property that comes back, or there's a method on that property, which is .fill. And .fill will take that and put it into our result. And I'm just going to put out null here because if you don't do this, you're going to get a whole bunch of stuff on the screen. So at this point, if I execute all this, right? So I'm going to hit play to run this. Let's see, we get a it says college scorecard.school doesn't exist. So maybe I don't have that table yet. Let's take a look. Oh, yeah, I don't have that table. I'll tell you what, just to make this easy, just to play around with it, I don't have a database here, right? So let's go back to PowerShell, and instead we're just going to do a different SQL command. We'll do select star from MySQL.user, right? See if that works. Oh, maybe it's users. I always forget. Nope. I will just do show schemas. I think I just don't have permission when you're inside that database. So show schemas, right? It's just a list of databases. I only have 2 databases in here, but But once I run that, if we look at $result, this is kind of the cool thing about PowerShell. You can just highlight a variable and hit this little play button up here, run selection, and it will show you the contents of that variable, right? So it tells me, I ran that, and it tells me that it's got a couple data rows in it, right? So I can also do something like this, right? I can do $result.tables 0, so that's going to be the first table. You got multiple tables, right? In a result, I'll show you how in just a minute here. But so when I run that, you can see we get our a whole list, right? These are all my schemas in my database, right? All my databases. So that's showing me the first table. But then I can also show I can show a single row. I think this works. Let me try this. I haven't tried this before. Oh wait, we have to do dot rows, I think. Yep. So dot rows. So we're going to do row 2. Right? So row 2 should be college scorecard. Let's see. Oh, we get MySQL, right? So row 2 is MySQL. Oh, because it's 0 based, right? So if we do 1, that's going to be college scorecard. And we can kind of go a little bit further here, right? So we can also do columns, right? Let's see. Instead of columns, I think you can just do. Should be able to do just 0 like this to give us the first field. Yep. Yeah. So you add the 0 on there, and you just get college scorecard, right? So that's just the string of that second one. And if I want to see what's in the next row, right? So we'll do row 4, right? So row 4 is test. Row 0, right, which is really the first row. That's information schema, right? So we can work with the results that we get back using these data structures, right? This data structure is the system.data.dataset object, which contains tables and rows. Now the thing is, what if you want to do a statement that is multiple batches, right? So instead of just schemas, I can add another query to this. So you may have tried this, right? You can have multiple SQL statements at the same time. You just separate them with the semicolon. So here I've got show schemas and then select star from MySQL.user. And if I run that, I basically get 2 tables. I don't know if you saw that pop up real quick, but essentially, so there's result 1, there's result 2, right? So 2 different tables come back. We can do the same thing from PowerShell, right? I should be able to execute two statements. So I added it here, and if this works, I don't know if this is going to work, so we can give it a shot here. So we get an error message, right? It says you have an error in your SQL syntax. Check the manual that corresponds to your server to use near select star from MySQL.user, right? So what I can tell you is that one of the problems with these ODBC drivers is sometimes you have to set some options in the driver. So if I go into the driver and click configure and go to details, under details there's a bunch of other stuff I can set, right? And one of the options in here usually is something about being able to get multiple, there we go, allow multiple statements, right? So if we hit that checkbox to allow multiple statements, if that's not checked, it'll only let you run one statement at a time. It doesn't support getting multiple data sets back, right? So if we do that, we turn that on, then we should be able to click OK and come back over here, run this again, and you can see it worked this time, right? I didn't get an error, but we selected here, we just selected from table 0, which table 0 in the first position, first column, right? So in row 1, you know, the first row and the first column has the value information schema, and if we change this to table number 1, we get a local host, which is from the other table, right? So going back to MySQL, right? So in this table, there it is, right? It's localhost. If I change it to table 3, or we'll do table 1, right? So, or I'm sorry, so table 1, row 1, the second row, the first column, we're going to get that other value, right? INFO-365 PA1, right? So you can see we can kind of start working with our tables this way. So could we use this and write pretty much the same script that I demonstrated with PHP? Absolutely, right? So the first thing I would do is I would create a function that executes these SQL statements instead of having to do this every time, right? And a couple things that you'd want to do first is I'm going to create a variable. So they have in PowerShell, you can use globals, right? So a global is basically a variable that's available anywhere in a script, right? So I'm going to create one called SQL user, and that's going to be root. And this is, again, just so I don't have to retype all this stuff over and over again. We're going to use functions. I have another global. It's going to be my SQL password. I'm just giving them an obvious name, right? That way, and actually this, I'm going to make them align with the labels in the ODBC settings. So this is going to be UID. That's going to be password, which is blank for our database. And then what's the other one we need? Oh yeah, the DSN. So in this case, the DSN is going to be INFO-365 64, right? So now that I've put these in down here, instead of having these hard-coded, I'm going to use the variable. That way somebody doesn't have to try to figure out how to do this, right? You know, somebody would be able to go in there and just set those variables at the top of the script, right? It's a little bit easier. So let's do this first. So the first one's got to be the DSN. And then a semicolon. Now the problem is, because there's a colon in here, it's going to kind of break the string, so you have to do it a little bit different. I don't know if you see what I'm doing here. This works in PowerShell. You put parentheses around the full variable and then put another $sign in front of it, and it basically allows you to embed this this inside the string without. So it basically escapes the weird characters inside your these functions and whatnot that you might have inside a string, which is kind of neat that you can do that. All right, so then my UID equals, and this is going to be UID. So again, I got to use the $sign, and then my password on the end, which I know ours is really just blank, but this way it'll work for somebody who needs a value there. And that's it, right? So that should work. If I hit play, it connects. We get a result, so that works. So the next thing I want to do is turn this into a function. So we're going to make a function called, I don't know, SQL query. Or MySQL query. There we go. I'm going to call it, well, I should call it MariaDB. There we go, MariaDB query. And the argument is going to be a statement that we're passing in. And then basically when we do that, it's going to open the connection. And then we don't need this line anymore because we're going to pass in a query. So the statement is, let's do this. We'll make this statement. Spell it out, that way it's different, right? We can keep result the same. We get the result, and then we're going to return the result. There we go. So we get a result back. Now, if I want to do a query, all I have to do, so we'll do query equals select star from, let me just copy and paste what I had from, alright, so there's my query, and then I'm going to create this result variable, right? I don't have to call it result, I could call it data set, right? Doesn't matter, call it anything I want, but that's going to be a system.data.dataset, right? And then to run my query, it's just dataset equals MariaDB dash query, and then I'm going to pass the argument, which is my query. And then finally down here, I should be able to output that data set, right? So if I run that and it works, right, I get my result right there. So I could do multiple, I can have different queries and just, run multiple different queries. So I can reuse this function over and over again, right? All right, so that's the first part. So now I've got my function. Now I can start trying to figure out how to work with my data. So the next step is we got to work with the, as you know, our data is actually in a, what do we call it, a spreadsheet, right? Our data dictionary, right? So I have to get that data dictionary into a variable, just like I did with the last script I showed you using PHP. So we're going to create a variable called dictionary, and it turns out that just like Python has some really good native libraries for dealing with CSVs, PowerShell does too. It's a little more elegant than I think it's actually a lot easier than PHP. Had I known that a lot of students already know PowerShell, I probably would have written this assignment for PowerShell instead, given how much easier this is. But so the variable is path, and I'm just going to pass in. I have mine on my clipboard here, the path to my dictionary file. All right, so there's my dictionary file. So if I run this, right, and by the way, if you hit just run selection, I'll just run that line. It basically takes this variable and it basically stuffs that whole CSV into that variable, right? And if I look at the contents of that variable, right, it's just a complex data structure that contains everything I need. And I don't really need any other functions. Everything, just works fine, right? So the next step is I'm gonna build. I have to somehow build a. I have to build the insert statements and everything, just like we did before. So how do I get data from this dictionary, right? So it turns out that's actually pretty easy, right? If you recall, what we had to do before is in our Excel spreadsheet, I wanted to get only the rows where it met a certain criteria. In this case, the other tables, which we did first, is basically all the tables where there was a key value pair, right? So there was something in that key value pair columns. You can kind of do it's interesting. It's almost like SQL, right? There's a, in PowerShell, they have this kind of cool option called where object, right? This is a commandlet called where object. And basically you pass in a SQL statement more or less, right? So I'm piping in that CSV file that's in $dictionary to where object. Where object is going to search where the column value, right? That's the column name. It's literally value, right? The column name is not equal to an empty string. So if I run this, it's only going to give me back all of the rows where value is not an empty string, which is exactly what I want, right? So then I could do a for each loop around that, right? So if I do a for each loop to get each row, right? So we're going to do $row in, and I think I showed you this before, right? We have to surround this with parentheses. And since this is a for each, I got to close that. So now I've got a for each loop that's going to basically go through each row, right? So if I write out each row, $row, and there's a whole bunch of different columns, right? One of the columns, so we have this one is key value pairs, right? So if you recall from that database table, there was a variable name was one, right? So variable, and it had a space in it. That's why I'm putting the single quotes around it. And then we also had and we had the key value pair, right? So it was something like value and then the other column was called, let's see if I can remember here. It's I can't remember. I might have to go look at the spreadsheet. It was value, and then yeah, I don't remember. Let me go open up the spreadsheet. I found it. It was label, right? So the other column in the spreadsheet was label. One other little trick here, if just to make things more readable, if you need to do a carriage return, right? It's grave symbol N or R for a carriage return. You can also do a grave T for a tab, you know, all the basic ASCII characters. So I'm just going to put a carriage return. That way we have a, you know, if we have a carriage return, it's easier to read, right? So if I run this, you can see it outputs all these different values, right? So these are all the different key value pairs that we'd want in our database, right? So it makes sense. So now we could, you know, try to work with this data and, you know, do our inserts just like we did previously. I have, and I'll show you what I did. So first I had to create a couple variables, which you can see here for my script to work. And then the first thing I wanted to check is to make sure that the double check that the variable name is not equal to nothing, right? Because if we don't have a variable name, or not to check if it's equal to nothing, but if it is equal to nothing, then that means we need a create table statement, right? Because this row is going to basically, if the variable name is populated, then is not equal to nothing, then that means that it's our table name, right? So it's how we create the table. So if there's no table name, then we're going to do a bunch of stuff that is going to create the table. So now I start to build that string, and I'll show you what this looks like. So create other tables as a string, and I just start to build it with my create statement. So $active table is a variable that I forgot to put in here for you. So let me copy that in here too. So I just create a active table variable that is the active table, right? This is the table I'm working with. It's whatever the variable name is. Variable name is the name of the table that we're creating, right, for these other tables. So that starts that create statement. And then we have another line where it creates the schema, right? So I've got to create the schema, right? This is the schema for that table. I'll put a tab in front of it just to make it a little bit more readable. And then we can start building that insert statement, right? So the insert statement is pretty straightforward. All right, so there's my insert statement. So I'm building the insert statement. I'm trimming it in case we already tried to do an insert statement previously, because it might have a trailing comma on the end, right? And then that's it for that section. If it's not true, right? So if or not if it's not true, but the next line is basically gonna write out that insert statement for that first line, and then each subsequent line. Sorry. And I think that's all we need, right? So when this is all done, we just got to trim up the string. And that should be it, right? So if I run this, right, so I just ran it, and now I should have these two variables. So create other tables should be populated. And you can see there's my create statements in there, right? So they're all there, which is great. And then my insert statements are all going to be here, right? So there's all my insert statements, nice and clean, right? Because I put that formatting in there with the tabs and the carriage returns, which is kind of cool. So my last step is I want to run that SQL statement. Now I could just output this to a file, which is super easy, by the way. If you want to output to a file, I'll show you what that command looks like. So that would just output it to a file, right? So if I run this, I'll have these files created, and you know it's pretty straightforward to write the file out, right? It's just the redirect to file. Easy peasy. But I could also run the query. Now here's the thing is if I want to run a query that doesn't get a result back, it's a slightly different syntax. And I'm going to show you what this looks like. So I'm going to create another function called non-query. And the only difference is for our non-query function is our ODBC command is basically the same. Everything is pretty much the same, except when we get to our execute command, which is oh yeah, see, we don't. So if we don't need to get a result set back, there's no return. Number one, I'm not going to need an object to store the return in, right? So this can go away. This whole line right here. I'm sorry, not that line. This line right here. So the result set can go away. We're not going to need it. I don't need a return. I also don't need this line, right? Because I'm not actually filling a result set. So that goes away. But now I have to just run the execute statement. So it's a little bit different. So it's going to be statement. Or no, I'm sorry. It's oh yeah, it's statement. So statement is the object, and it's going to be execute non-query. So that's going to execute our query. And then, and one thing I did forget to put in here is we need to make sure we close the SQL connection when we're done with it, right? So you're going to do a close, and then dispose. I'm going to make sure I put that on my other function as well. Right, that way we don't have connections hanging open. So since I added that function and I changed this one, I'm just going to execute those two functions so they're in memory now. And if I scroll down here, I can call that function now, right? So calling it's pretty straightforward. It's just MariaDB dash non-query. And I'm going to pass in first my create tables. Then I got to do it again for the insert tables, right? So first it'll create, then it'll insert, and that's it, right? So I didn't have any tables in my database, right? If I come back over here, I'm going to refresh this. There's nothing here, right? I have no tables to work with yet, so hopefully this will actually create those other tables. So let's see if it works. And I don't need any of this stuff down here anymore. So let me get rid of that. All right, and here goes nothing. I'm going to give it a shot and see if this does what it's supposed to. Oh, it did something. So if we go back over here, refresh, I've got my tables now, right? So it created the tables. I know one that should have a bunch of values is going to be relofill. Oh, it's lowercase. There we go. There we go. Yeah, so there's all my values, right? So it worked. It ran the insert. So I don't have to go and do it separate, right? Directly in MariaDB. I can just, let it do it from this ODBC connection, right in the script. So now we get to the section where we need to, where we're going to want to create our actual table. So I'm really just porting this over from PHP. It's the exact same script that I demonstrated in PHP. So it looks very familiar, right? Again, we have to declare integer and float so that we've, got some static values to work with for integer and float. We need a create table statement, which is right here. I need to know what active table I'm working with in the loop. And I'm going to also create a data structure for tables so I can reference it later on for my inserts. We're going to use the exact same method we did before, right? So if I already have that dictionary, right? The dictionary is still in memory at this point, right? So at this line, if I run dictionary, it's all still there. But this time, my query for dictionary is going to be a little bit different. So we're going to do where object again. But my query is, well, let's see. I think, just thinking this through, another way to work with a CSV, it's really just an object, right? So if I just, we just want to get a list of all of the tables, right? So it was a dev category. So this should be basically just a list of all the dev categories from the dictionary, right? It's just another way to do it. It's just going to list them over and over and over again, right? So if I wanted to, because what I really want to do here is I want to loop through just the unique name of all the tables, right? I don't want to get them over and over again. I want to get the a unique name. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to redirect the output to sort object because I want to sort it alphabetically. Right, so now it should all be in the same order alphabetically. And then there's another function in another commandlet that'll basically, it's sort of like the distinct keyword in SQL, it's get unique. So that'll just get me all the unique values. So now, nice clean list. We just have a list of all of our tables, right? Which is all I want, right? I want to loop through the list of table names that are in that CSV. And then I'm going to loop through the data that's in for each one of those tables. So this is going to be a for each loop for each table that's in that list, right? And I have to put a $sign around this because it's a statement, right? All right, so for each table, just like in the, if you recall in the script from PHP, I had to first check to make sure that the table is not null, right? I want to make sure it's not null. I want to make sure it's not blank because we don't want table names that are blank or null. So I got to filter those out. But I'm also checking to make sure the table is not completion because we're not working with that table. It's too big, right? It's a giant table. It's not going to work for this assignment, so we're not going to use that. But if that's true, then I'm going to create a new object, right? Not a new object, really just a new data structure inside tables, right? So tables is a sort of a complex data structure. In this case, it's a hash table. Right, so we have a hash table. The first element of that hash table is going to also be another hash table. It's going to contain multiple values. So it's the name of the table, right? So for each table, we're going to create a hash table with the name of that table. And then the next step is we have to do the first line of our create table statement, right? So we're going to create that table name, right? So there's $table. So we're going to create that table name. Notice the double graves here, so that'll just output as one grave in PowerShell because the escape character in PowerShell is a grave, so you just have to have two of them. It's a little bit different than we did in SQL. So that starts the create table statement. The next line of the create table statement is we have to create the unique ID, right? So we create the table, then the first column is the unique ID. I'm using a 2 upper because I want the column name to be all uppercase, right, for ID. And it's going to be an auto increment column, which we talked about before. There's a special case that if, as long as we want to add the OPE ID, because that's our foreign key in all the tables, if you recall from that dictionary. So for a special case when as long as it's not root, because if it's root, it already has OPID, but if it's not root, so if the table is not equal to root, then we have to add that OPID field into our table. So I'm going to add that. Now we get to the next step, which is basically we're back to needing to do a loop. And I'll just show you what I did here. I'm going to copy and paste some code and explain what it does. So again, back to dictionary. Now that we know what the table name is, right, we're going to select all the rows where the dev category is equal to whatever the current table name is. So for example, if it's school, this is going to output all of the rows where it's school, right? But also I want to make sure that variable name is not populated. I want to make sure that's blank because that's going to be if the variable name is not blank or is blank, then it's a column that we don't want, right? Because that's one of the other tables, right? We already worked with those. So that's just the logic that I used for that. So again, that's going to be a for each, right? Because we want to do basically we want for each one of those rows. Right, so there we go. I always try to close my loops. All right. So next step is we're going to start building. First we want to get the comment. Right, the comment field is a special case because we have to trim it down a little bit. Right. So all I'm doing here is I'm getting from the first row. I'm finding name of data element, which we're using as the comment, and as long as it's not null, and if it's you know, it's not null, and it's what is this here? It's and it's not blank, right? So if it's not null, it's not blank, I know I've got a comment to work with. So I'm going to set a variable called $comment. I don't know if I set that elsewhere. I did not. But anyway, we're going to take $comment and just populate. We're going to get rid of any single quotes because it's going to break SQL. We're going to use a substring to set the maximum length to 1024. This is how you do it in PowerShell. It's a little weird in PowerShell. It was certainly a lot easier in PHP, but probably one of the few things that's easier in PHP, right? All right, so that gets our comment. And then the next line, we're going to, let me just copy and paste this for you so you can see what we're doing here. All right, so now we are, as long as the value is not equal to blank, we're going to continue creating the, doing the create table statement, right? Also making sure I populate this table, the tables variable with all the stuff we need, because we're going to have to use that variable later on when we do, just like we did in PHP, right? It's almost exactly the same structure, using the same logic. I'm going to set the data type to varchar 2048, but then check to see if it's an integer or a float and change it, right? So it'll be varchar 2048 unless it finds one of these fields. This is probably not the best way to do it, right? Because varchar 2048 is a pretty long field. You know, if we really wanted to get fancy, we could detect the longest size in the data and, you know, make this variable based on, you know, the longest field, which actually isn't too hard in PowerShell because we have the entire object and we could check the maximum length of that field if we wanted to. So yeah, so this is basically just finishing off that create table statement, right? And then at the very end of all this, right? So after we're done setting all this, the sort of last piece outside this for each. So after this for each statement, we need to add 2 more columns, right? So this is looping through and adding all of our columns in here. But once we're done looping through and adding all these columns, we have 2 more columns. The report year we're going to add to the end. Then we're also going to set the primary key to whatever the table name is, _ID, right? That's our primary key. It's that auto increment field that we used. Set the engine to INFO-DB, set the default character set, put a couple carriage returns in so it's nice and clean. And that's it, right? So this should create our create statements for these, you know, these big tables that that we have to create. So if we run this, assuming I did it right, it looks like I did. Now if I look at the value of create tables, there's all my create table statements, right? They're all there. And once again, instead of copying and pasting it over to MariaDB, I can just come over here. And I'm just going to run it right from here. Right, so if I run this whole thing, let's go back over to MariaDB, right? So right now, I don't have, for example, there is no school table. If I run this, it's going to give me an error because school doesn't exist yet. And then I'm going to come back over to my PowerShell. I'm going to run this. And then back over here. Now I don't get an error, right? I just get a table that has no values, which is what I want, right? Just to keep this video from getting too long, I'm just going to paste in the code that I used. Well, I'll show you kind of the beginning here. So one thing is the data file is enormous, right? That data file is so large that if you try to read it all into memory, you probably don't have enough memory in PowerShell to handle the entire file, that data file. So I'm going to use a different mechanism instead of, it'd be nice if we could treat it as a CSV because, you know, it creates this nice data structure for you that's easy to reference the column names and all that stuff. But a file reader in .NET is a lot faster than trying to read the entire file into memory. So we're going to do this instead, right? So this is just going to read the entire file. So that means we have to do something a little bit different here. And I'm going to show you what we're going to do. So first, now I need to, because I'm not getting a CSV, I have to figure out what those column headers are. Luckily, it's a little bit easier. You know, this is a much easier process, I think, with PowerShell. It's pretty neat. But anyway, the way it works with and I'm just going to copy and paste, and I'll show you what I'm doing here just so you can see. But the way it works with PowerShell, with the data reader, you use the this reader as an object that when you call it, you can read the next line. So basically, this is going to set the line variable to the next line, one line at a time. So that means each run of this loop is going to read the next line of the file till it gets to the end of the file, and then it'll exit the loop, and that's it. One thing that I like to do when I do troubleshooting, right? So this is helpful for troubleshooting. You can name, it's kind of a cool little feature here in PowerShell. You can name portions of the script. That way, if you have to break out of the script, you can break back to a certain point in the script. It gives you a little bit more control when you run break commands, and this is useful for troubleshooting loops. So that's why I do that. I might not need to do that here, but just good practice, I think, when you create loops. So the first thing I got to do, when we do this, the first thing we need to do is check to see if it's the first, say if we have the column list. So all I'm doing here is checking this columns array, or this is an array, not a hash table. That's why it's parentheses here instead of the brackets. So this is a hash table. This is creating an array. So I'm creating an array, and I'm checking to see if the count is 0. If it has no items in that array, then I know I don't have the column names from my CSV. So this will just basically, this line right here just gets the column names. It's just going to split that line based on the comma, and then we have our columns. If that is the column names, we don't want to process it, right? So that's why I'm doing an else statement here. But if it isn't, right, if that is already populated, that means we've got the column names and we're ready to start looking at our fields. And to get the fields is the same thing, right? To get our list of fields, it's just we're going to split the next line that we get to on the comma. That's going to get us a list of fields. And what's interesting about this is because I have the column names here, and now I've got the fields, and they're both indexed on the same number, right? They both have the same number of elements. I can use that tables, and I'll show you here. So if you recall, I had a variable I created called tables before, right? So it's basically each table and a list of all the columns for each one of those tables, right? And if I do tables.keys, right, this is basically all of my table names, right? Nice shorthand to get my table names so I don't have to go back to that dictionary file. So at this point, I just need to iterate through each table and find all the values from the CSV that match each table to build my insert statement, right? That's it. Pretty straightforward. So that's going to be a for each to get each table. And for my first if statement, if block, let me just copy and paste this. I'm burning a lot of time in the video here, but for the first if block, data inserts, if you see here, is actually a hash table. So really, I'm building the inserts one line at a time in a hash table, right? So basically, I have data inserts is one object that has all the inserts for all the different tables, all in one giant object, right? It's going to build all these insert statements into one giant hash table. So when I get to the next table, every time I get to another table, the first thing I'm going to do when I get to the next table is I'm just going to see if that table exists yet, right? So if that table does not yet exist, I have to put the prefix for the insert statement. But otherwise, if that, when I get done creating that table, I'm going to close that. Oh, I already closed that if statement. Sorry. The next step here, let me just go back over here. So that's just checking to see if the table exists yet or not. But if that table does exist, then I'm ready to start doing my insert statement. So this block that I'm going to paste in here, this is what's going to build my, I'm basically going to create my value list, and I'm just going to create the values in that, for that object, right? For that data inserts line. So that's going to loop through, and then when that's all done, my last step is I need to do my insert statement, right, in SQL, which is pretty straightforward. Now here's the thing, is if you try to do all the inserts right? If you build that entire object, right, which theoretically I could do, right? If I run this right now, and I'm going to do this for you. If I just run this whole thing right here. Oh, by the way, one important step here I don't want to miss. You have to close the data reader. Otherwise, it keeps it in memory, right? Which is not very efficient. So we're going to close that. Do our own garbage collection here. So if I run this, it's going to take a long time to run, right? It's going to sit here running forever and ever and ever. It's basically building this data inserts object that contains all my tables. I'm just going to stop it. We'll see how far it got here, right? So you can see it started running. There's too much to show for value, so it doesn't show you anything. But inside, for example, if I let me just output data inserts school, I guess, right? Let's see what's in school. Right, you could see here's all the insert statements that it started running, right? Now, one thing is there's a trailing comma at the end, right? So we'll have to trim that. But I could just iterate through all these table inserts and let it roll. But if I did that, I would be inserting 6,000 rows on each run, which might, I think ODBC tends to have some issues when you try to do too many inserts. So what I did is I broke it up so it was only running 500 at a time, and I'll show you how I did that. Right, so what I'm doing here is so I'm checking to see if $n is what $n is, right? If it's greater than 500, meaning that I have at least 500 rows to insert that I've built as I'm going through each one of these rows, then it's going to iterate through each of the tables, and I'm just going to put a little log message here to say what it's doing. And it's going to do the data insert, right? It's going to output a file of all the inserts, right? Which is probably don't want to do that because I don't want a whole bunch of files. But and then it's going to run the actual insert, but it's going to trim that trailing comma on the end. When it's done, it's going to set n back to 0, so it starts over, counting up, and it's going to make sure that it removes everything from data inserts, right? It's going to reinitialize data inserts. So it starts over again, rebuilding that object to do the next 500 rows. Otherwise, if we haven't hit 500 yet, it's just going to increment and keep incrementing until it gets to 500 again. And then that's it, right? Then it's done. I don't think I need this at the end. I don't know what I was doing here. This we can get rid of. I think I was just playing with something there and it got into my copy-paste. All right, so this is going to take a while to run, right? This is not going to run fast, but I'm going to go ahead and hit play. We'll see if it starts doing stuff here. There we go. So you can see it's running. It's doing some inserts. And if I come back over here, I'm going to run this statement. You can see I'm starting to get some records. I can do a count star. Right, 1003. Wait till it runs again, right? Because it's just going to loop through. And I think we have a total of 8,000 records, maybe, right? Now we're up to 1505. Right, keep going. 2007, right? So it's going, it's building. Now, I did forget something here. I realized what I was doing at the end here. So what I had here all the way at the end after this outer loop, I remembered why I had that last statement there. Because if it gets to 500, there's still going to be some records left to insert potentially, right? So that's all I'm doing here is getting a list of all the tables. And for each one of those tables, just running the data inserts here. Some of them are going to fail because they won't be tables that exist in that object, but that's okay. Who cares? I'm just playing around with the script. However, at this point, I've got a bunch of data in there, and that's obviously going to be a problem, right? If I try to run the whole script again. So if I needed to try running this, over and over again, I wrote a little thing here in the beginning that's just going to go ahead and drop everything from my database, right? So this will basically take everything out. It's going to loop through each one, so show tables, right? It just shows all the tables. It's just going to drop all the tables. So everything just gets blown out of my database, and then it executes that command, and then it goes through and does the rest of the script. Now, if you try to just hit the button to run the script, it should work. If you save the file and hit run, sometimes it won't work unless you change your execution policy. But it'll work on mine because I haven't done that, but I haven't saved the file yet. But you can see here, it's starting over from the beginning again, and it's going to start running through and building those insert statements. There we go. So we've got insert statements. I'm going to come back over to MariaDB. All right, I got 501. I'm just going to keep letting this run until we get all the insert statements. All right, so it finished running. And as I said, there would be a few times it errors from that last statement because there'll be a couple tables that obviously don't exist in that last part, but I don't really care because this is just for me, right, to run it to import my tables. So now if I check my count, I should have, yep, there we go, 7,175 records. And I should be able to do some queries here. So we'll do inst name, right, the institution name, and then from school we'll do a join. Right, this is the last part of the of that assignment, right? To just check to see if this worked. To do a join to one of the other tables, just to see if the relationships are there and whatnot. School dot relafill. All right, see if that works. There we go, and just to make sure, we'll show the religious affiliation. There we go. So list of schools and their religious affiliation. We'll see a list of the ones that are in Pennsylvania, right? So where state abbreviation equals PA. See how many religious affiliated schools they have in Pennsylvania, right? So there you go. All right, so that worked, right? So we were able to write the whole thing. So I'll post this, and you're welcome to take a look at it, use it if you want. But you could certainly use PowerShell to work with MariaDB directly, which is kind of convenient. Thank you.